Hello, I'm Judith Panera, Executive Director of AMC and AMC Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you for joining us. Our offices are located in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and the labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. AMC is dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for today's program and all our programs, events, and overall work, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, has been posted in our chat feature. We are grateful to our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge and welcome all our members here today and express our gratitude to them for being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Please also be sure to check out our YouTube channel to see recordings of past programs as well. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kat Dunn, and with me today, I have Ashanti Harris and Kevin Farmer. I will now go ahead and just quickly do their bios so that we can really get into the heat of it. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. So Ashanti Harris, Ashanti is a multidisciplinary visual artist, teacher, and researcher working with dance, performance, and installation. Her practice has a focus on recontextualizing historical narratives, dissecting epistolomies of mobilities, and that means the movement of people, ideas, and things, and the wider social implications of those movements, specifically in relation to the diaspora of West Africa and the Caribbean. Ashanti's current research is concerned with the body as a repository of incorporated histories which are communicated through dance and movement practices. As part of her creative practice, she is co-director and co-lead artist for Project X, a creative education program platforming dance and performance from the African and Caribbean diaspora, and works collaboratively as part of the collective Glasgow Open Dance School, facilitating experimental movement workshops and research groups. Most recently, Ashanti has had one of her bodies of work, History Haunts the Body, acquired by the National Galleries of Scotland. Welcome, Ashanti. With us again today, we have Kevin Farmer. Kevin is currently Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. He has lectured in archaeology in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad, and also in the MA Heritage Studies program at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. As Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum, he has the responsibility for museum exhibition programming and capital campaign fundraising. Kevin's own research interests include the creation of cultural identity in post-colonial states, the role of museums in national development, the management and curation of archaeological resources, and the role of heritage in national development. Kevin is the principal researcher on the Barbados Museum's nomination to the Memory of the World Register, examining the location and condition of extant documents relating to slavery and the slave trade in the Caribbean, which resulted in its successful encryption. Kevin is the co-editor of the publication entitled Pre-Colonial and Post-Colonial Contact Archaeology in Barbados 2019, Plantation to Nation, Caribbean Museums and National Identity 2012, along with numerous other articles written on cultural resource management, heritage in the age of climate change, historical archaeology, and the future of heritage development in the Caribbean. He's a member of the International Association of Caribbean Archaeologists and Museum Association of the Caribbean. He's provided expert advice to regional partners on the 1970 UNESCO Convention, disaster resilience, and museum development. And Shanti and Kevin, you have no idea how happy I am to be speaking to you. A very warm welcome to this webinar. Would you both like to say a quick few words before we jump in?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Kat, for inviting me to be here. And I know that your kind of bio has been put in the chat and that you were just going to say a bio for us, but I just wanted to say, as someone who's based in Scotland, where Kat is predominantly working, Kat is an activist curator who's really shaking things up in Scotland. So just so you know who's asking the questions today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to being stuck into this conversation. Hopefully it inspires, but also provokes some really interesting thought amongst those who've joined us today. But thanks so much for inviting me. And Ashanti, really lovely to meet you.
We'll be all firm friends by the end of it, I'm sure. So with no further ado, what I love about each of you actually, is the fact that you incorporate aspects of collective action from local level to implement ongoing change at the local, regional, and national levels within your roles, which is amazing for me, as my own exhibitions, as you know, are about identity and therefore always seen as political. So I'm super keen to understand how and why you do what you do in accordance to what I do. And I'm going to start with Ash. You've just obviously completed this incredible project last weekend at Platform that I was honored to go and see. Can you tell us more about how you started to work with Platform as a collective and about the project in general, please?
Yeah, sure. So Platform is an art centre. Sorry, some sirens. Hopefully no one can hear that. Platform is an art centre that is based in the east end of Glasgow in Scotland. It's an area that has a lot of economic diversity. It features on the kind of like, I can't remember, there's like a special name for it, but it's the kind of lower socio-economic kind of index for Scotland. And this art centre was built over a decade ago to kind of bring culture to this area that doesn't necessarily have access to it and isn't so well connected to the rest of the city. I've been working with Platform in a variety of different ways over a number of years, but they recently asked me to do a community project where the intention is to co-create an artwork in collaboration with the local community. It's a project that they do really often. They do it multiple times a year, but they were finding that after the pandemic, it wasn't the same. People weren't wanting to necessarily come together as a community in a social space in the same way. People were still a little bit nervous and a little bit tentative about that. So I proposed to do a project where instead of it, that would kind of build up to bringing everyone together, but would start by working one-on-one. I trained in sculpture as a sculptor, and I wanted to make casts of everybody's faces. It's also a really kind of culturally diverse community. And Scotland is surprised, people will be surprised to hear, a culturally diverse country, but that's not necessarily how the country is represented outside of being there and seeing and knowing and experiencing. So I wanted to work with people from heritage from the Caribbean, of course, which is my heritage, from Africa and Asia, to celebrate the different cultures that are entangled with the cultures of Scotland. So we were doing these projects where I was taking casts of people's faces, creating these statues that represent the diversity of the area. And at the end, and in the process, we'd work one-on-one. And whilst we were waiting after they'd had this kind of process of casting their faces, while we waited for the plaster to dry so they could see what we'd made together, we shared stories and we talked about ourselves. I asked them lots of questions about who they were. And we kind of used a methodology of thinking of who we are as being partly where we've come from, like our past, partly where we are right now and what our everyday experiences are, and partly what our dreams are for the future. And I created a series of carnival procession-inspired flags that incorporated the faces and the images and also some of the stories of the people that I was working with. And I guess thinking about your question, Kat, in relation to change, like creating change within your community, I definitely try to incorporate that in all projects that I do. I love working with people, I love working with communities, but also in a way that's about giving community a voice. I think Scotland especially, it's not enough to just kind of invite people to the museum or to the gallery, because they're places that people have felt excluded from. It's finding ways for people to find and feel an ownership, so to kind of walk into the space and literally, in this instance, seeing themselves on the wall in gold, and feeling like this place is theirs for them to be. So yeah, I think that maybe answers your question.
That was awesome. Thank you. And slightly different, Kevin, the last time I saw you, if I remember correctly, you just come from an archaeological dig in St. George in Barbados. So can you elaborate on why you are at a dig, and how does this play into your role as deputy director, or is it just like a separate thing altogether?
Thanks. Actually, it's not separate. Before I became deputy director, I was actually curator for history and archaeology at the museum. So for me, archaeology is pivotal to be telling the story of Barbados and Barbadians. Yes, it's the past, but it's also the present. For me, archaeology allows us, no pun intended, to excavate the past, to not only speak about what happened there, but what stories can be told at that particular point in time has a special relevance to us today, and how we can in fact learn from the past. I mean, the recent work I've done with a colleague, Andrea Richards, was to drive around the country, and we began to take readings of sites that we knew that were near the coast and how they might in fact be affected by climate change, which is not just an existential crisis for us globally, but then at the local level, it's very much a physical threat to how we live on a small island and within a region that are, 13 plus small island developing states. And how do we go about trying to preserve that past in light of this existential threat? So that's one aspect of it. The other, in respect to being head of exhibitions programming at the museum, is being able to sit with the curators and have discussions about how do we tell the multiple stories about ourselves. So the most recent exhibition which we've just done, which is a fantastic journey into co-curation, was called the Looker. Called Looker, Dismantling the Colonial Gaze, where we invited in 5 young female photographers, and we asked them to explore our postcard collection and be inspired by it and create works in juxtaposition to the postcards that they selected. So Rita Cabot Charles was a co-creator with myself and Natalie McGuire-Matson. The artists were herself, Delissa Marshall, Tia Redmond, Amber Newton, and Zoe Maynard. And the works that they created were phenomenal. You guys go up to the museum's Facebook page to see what's there. It's a really fantastic catalog. And it was about the reclaiming of agency, especially when you look at those historic postcards and historic photographs. Persons are either hired as models in some instances, or captured as they're going to work, and literally captured and asked to pose, sometimes without their consent in a way. And we have this production of images, and we always have to ask, who were they being produced for? Who was the consumer? And what did that, in fact, due to the framing out or creation of what the Caribbean is. And you find in most instances, these postcards come about at the turn of the century as we're getting into the switch, moving away from selling agricultural products to selling the island and its culture as another form of product in what was then a nascent tourism sector. And you see how truly exploitative that was. So how then do we create works that seek to allow for agency and autonomy? And the works created by the artists, as I said, was simply phenomenal. And that's part of what the museum has been doing, I would argue, almost for the last 10 years in a very deliberate way. Whether we're the venue for regional art exhibitions like Arrivants in 2018, or internally we look at our own history with Insurgents in 2019 that looked at insurgency across the written history of Barbados from as early as the 1630s during enslavement to what was our own local Me Too movement called Life in Leggings in 2018, 2019, to speak to the fact that we're not as passive as people think we are, or that we've portrayed ourselves to be for others for a whole host of reasons. But how there's this continual struggle, whether it's a large rebellion or strikes, or some of it turned physical. I'm not using the word violent, turned physical, and exploring that, and then looking at Black presence and how we've been represented within this Western canon, sometimes in a derogatory manner, but on those few occasions, again, through our own types of agency. So it's been a really exciting time for us at the museum. The curatorial staff and have been absolutely phenomenal. And the reaction from persons who come and see has also equally been phenomenal. And in a way, it's because of the visitors' reaction that we've recognized, this is something that we need to continue to explore and bring to light, and have really just some of the difficult discussions that are necessary, that sometimes are only possible through art. So that's it.
You've kind of semi-answered something else I was going to log on to, so I'm going to come back to you. No, it's fine. It's fine. This is exactly what we want. I'm going to come back to you because the next two questions I'll kind of put together, I suppose. I guess in terms of Ashanti, especially, and myself, we've had many, many talks about how her work is made predominantly for the diaspora, to re-educate us on our stories, our history, to bring us back to our pride, I suppose, especially as we live somewhere that we're not in. For the audience that's listening, I should say that Ashanti represents Guyana, Barbados, and Scotland, and Kevin represents Barbados, and I am also from Barbados and now live in Scotland. So we all have dual and multiple identities, but I always kind of look at all of us as kind of global citizens, which kind of leads in very nicely to what I'm about to ask. Because Ashanti, your work is, you've said yourself, your work is definitely for the diaspora. And this is something that I know that you're fiercely proud about. Why have you chosen to make work that's there to, I guess, to remind us of our stories? I remember, the reason I'm asking, I remember being a little girl on my grandmother's knee, and you're told the reality, you're told the truth of history. And as I'm now a curator, I constantly go back to those stories. On the island, we still eat the same food. We're still drinking coconut water. When I was on the island, that was like, I had a list of things I had to consume just for me to feel like I was back on the rock, as it were. So when you were making work, even if you're working with grassroots organizations, you're very much about the work is for the diaspora. Why do you choose to do this?
There's actually too many reasons to say, I think. But I guess the main thing is I grew up in, for most of my life, most of my sort of education life anyway, in the UK, and away, like really far away from my Guyanese culture and from Caribbean culture. I had access to a lot of diasporic culture in the UK. And I guess the way that I kept a connection with Guyana was through the stories that people told me, the music that people played me, the food that people fed me, through these really kind of like embodied experiences. And then when I moved to Scotland and I went to art school, and just being in this country in general, I didn't ever feel like I ever had access to this culture, which was it was bizarre to me, because growing up in England, there was a lot of the way that I got access to my culture was through art, and was through going to dance classes, and was through these kind of like creative embodied things. And I struggled for a really long time in Scotland. But I have been here for 15 years now. And over that time, I've met a really incredible community of artists, of collaborators, of people with shared heritage with me. And just kind of, I guess over time, the way that how much they inspire and feed into what I do, and for how much I guess I look to them as the audience for the things that I'm thinking about and the things that I'm exploring. It's just kind of happened naturally. And then alongside that, then it became a little bit of I guess like an activist response. It was also, now I'd found this community. I knew that everybody was here. I could see everybody. I also watched the population in Scotland changing really rapidly over the past 10 years. And then it felt political. It felt like, okay, everybody's here, and why can't you see it? Like, I just want to make something. Why can't people see each other? So I just wanted to create things that brought community together, that brought like a diasporic community together in celebration of a shared history and a shared heritage. I guess I just like the concept of being part of a diaspora. There's no single story. There's no single kind of narrative of migration. Everybody's is so immensely different, but sits under this lovely shared umbrella. So I like creating, I guess, like community artworks or participatory artworks or co-created artworks, where all of these little voices can kind of come together in a bit of a choir, break off into their own verses and come back together again. And it just feels really, really important. And also I think there's a shared knowledge, a shared understanding that there is so much of the time our history is always centered in the pain and the trauma and the sadness, and it just gets too much. Like, there's the things that I want to celebrate is like joy, strength, creativity, imagination, like all of these things that are so incredibly just wonderful about Caribbean culture, about the African and Caribbean diaspora. But I also recognize that all of these things exist within a context of a painful history. So trying to think of ways by focusing on the diaspora as my audience, I'm thinking about how we can create collective joy, but also how we can collectively care for each other with kind of shared knowledge of like how we need to be cared for in the process of celebrating, and why we need to take space and all of these things. So yeah,
I completely agree. I think for me, the idea of making exhibitions, and I always kind of say that I co-curate or co-create, because as I'm making exhibitions, I'm having conversations with people like yourself. I'm having conversations with the artists. It's consistently informing the exhibition. It's not just a case of, hey, here's a white room and I'm going to chuck some stuff in it and I'm going to walk away. It's always going to have a narrative to it. And I'm working consistently with artists and collaborators and medical doctors, and I'm pulling in all sorts of people to be able to tell that story, because for me, that's the thing. There's so much pain and trauma and generational trauma that we're dealing with, but then in doing this this idea of co-curation and co-creation, there's this joy that comes from it. And you will hear somebody laugh in the middle of something and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, we're going to go keep on this path. And so I completely agree with you. And Kevin, I'm going to bring you in here because obviously you're not a freelancer, you're not working with grassroots organizations per se. And there's that larger institution of the Barbados Museum. But do you think that when you're looking at creating new exhibitions and creating work, that you have the sense of like re-educating the diaspora? And the reason I'm saying that is because there's now obviously this tourist capitalism that's going on, right? This almost whitewashing of our own history. Or is it kind of more towards educating like a global audience? Like when you spoke about the artists, for instance, looking at those postcards and, you know, almost reimagining, is that for people at home who can go like, hey, this is how we look in a different context? Or is it more for a global audience who might not know anything at all about the island other than, you know, sun, sea, tourism?
Yeah. Well, what I'll say is I think first and foremost, our audience is always local, but the story is global. So whether you walk into the museum or you go online where we might post an image or stories about like, the various exhibitions, it has a particular human story and human element about it that then resonates with you, regardless of whether this is part of your culture. And the museum as an institution has deliberately over the last decade plus be really trying to view itself as that safe space in where all of the difficult narratives can find a voice, where different communities and different experiences can come and allow us to have the real conversations about them to each other and to us. Because we must also remember that Barbados is also a multicultural and a multi-ethnic island as well. And there's a need to tell those multiple stories. And so the museum has positioned itself in being that area, that space that allows those narratives to be spoken about. And in essence, for us then to become truly democratic about the stories that we tell, the good and the bad, the sad and the happy, and also the nuance, because our history is not black or white. There are different tonalities of gray, and it's about allowing the time and the space to tell it, and in its different ways. And what we've also recognized is once we started a particular theme around an exhibition, is well, what do we learn from it? Do we repeat it? Do we repeat it in a slightly different way? How can we build on it, both for our creatives and the audiences who we're trying to reach? So for us, co-curation has become very much embedded in how we go about doing our work. I'll give an example. We recently, 2 years ago, opened up a new children's gallery, and the entire process around how that exhibition was created brought in parents and teachers and special ed teachers to really have a discussion about, well, what do we want to see? And there was a point in time where, before the exhibition opened, we set it up and we brought children in to literally run through it, play, tell us what they liked or didn't like. And I remember one young man, after about half hour, his parents said, well, it's time to go home. And he cried. He didn't want to leave, simply because the exhibitions had inspired him. And for once, he could come to a museum and literally touch what was on display and learn. And for me, that all of that was possible because of the stakeholders that we brought in to help us to shape what was there. And I truly think that is really the way that museums especially in this region, need to bring on board and begin to evolve in telling the different stories and telling the multiple stories to recognize who we are as Caribbean people, and then how that story then resonates to our diaspora, and how that then beyond the diaspora resonates in those spaces in which they now call home, whether they're first, second, or third generation. And I think that's a key focus for us.
That was a great answer. I think that now what I'm going to ask is for both of you. So just jump in whenever you've got a thing. Now I've set the scene, as it were. So as I said before, we're all from the Caribbean, but I also consider us to be global citizens. And you've kind of mentioned a little bit about how that plays out. But are there any specific kind of combining any approaches to empower vulnerable communities to develop as reflection of their own needs and values? And by this, I'm thinking, you know, there's so many different ways of means of having communities now involved. Especially Ashanti, for yourself, is working with grassroots organizations, which is of course different to you, Kevin, than being in an institution such as the Barbados Museum. But do you think that there's any kind of similarities between what you do and how you do it?
Yeah. Well, what I'll say is, yes, I work in an institution, but we do some grassroots work. And I think part of the reason why we pivoted towards co-curation is exactly that. It's about our ability to have those conversations and those engagements with vulnerable communities, and see how we can go about telling their story. And I think that's critically important, because museums, well, they exist for many reasons, but for me, museums exist as that space where all of the national story is told, not one aspect of the national story, but all of it. So if you want to speak to all of it, it does mean at some point in time, you need to understand what people are thinking, what people are feeling, provide the space and time for that communication and the listening and the engagement, to hopefully come out at the other side and say, okay, this is the type of exhibition that we might want to see, or these are the types of talks that we want to have, or the types of workshops that we want to do, to reflect who we are within this community, to the majority of people who are there. So I think part of it is about the sensitivity and listening. That's key and critical, and it's not something that curators are trained to do naturally, and that becomes the other important thing.
I think it depends if you're a curator of objects or people.
Well, there you go, and learning the new skill set of listening to people, and how then do you amplify their story with the objects you might have, or by the objects that they have. So sometimes you simply don't have it in your collection, but they might have it at home. But it's about them feeling safe enough to have those conversations with you. So that's where, for me, the communication and the engagement becomes really, really key. And that they are, in fact, completely part of the process. So you're working together to create this exhibition or this program, or this webinar. So there has to be a give and take. But listening to me is something that we've had to learn, and continue to learn from. And COVID, in a way, made us listen even more, because most of us were closed. But how then do you reach people? And you recognize something as simple as, well, send us a photo that inspired you today, and or Members Day, then we put up on Facebook. Or what kind of talk can we have, especially during a period where people didn't quite understand, or we'd lost a generation who'd gone through a pandemic. So we posted things on the last pandemic back in 1917 and realized that how people reacted then is how we were reacting now. So sometimes human nature repeats itself, but it also means that we can learn from the past. But COVID was, to me, in and amongst the turmoil and the suffering, it did make museums have to rethink what we do. And it did make us realize that first, we need to listen. And two, we need to use this technology more in creating engagement and creating community in a new way. And I think that's one of the legacies coming out of COVID, is the way in which we've embraced this new media and new platform, both in terms of outreach and engagement. And long may it continue as well.
Ashanti, do you want to jump in and say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin, you've said so much there, and I think I'm just with you all the way there. But yeah, I think, I mean, the main thing that I was sort of jumping on with what you were saying is responsive as well, like the responsiveness that's come out of the pandemic, but also we've always had to be responsive. The kind of, I guess, the responsive to changing funding situations, responsive in Scotland to the different ways in which people have decided to sort of, what's the word, like really jump on representations of marginalized or minority groups versus, and how that becomes extractive and versus kind of meaningful opportunities, and always just kind of have responsive is something that I feel like I've always had to be. I feel like my community has always had to be. And something about the pandemic has maybe caught everybody else up with this idea of kind of being responsive, taking that time to really like listen and hear and process and receive and act in response to all of this that's kind of come in. And then the other thing I wanted to say is you started with the opposite, Kevin. You said, even though you work in a museum, there's still like a grassroots element of it. And I want to say the opposite just here. Even though I work in a grassroots way with community, the work that I do does also kind of feature in museum spaces. And I'm also, I guess, really interested in how to sort of take that kind of or maybe like community connection and incorporate it into a sort of more formal museum space. The piece of work that Kat mentioned in my bio that was acquired by the National Collection, it's actually a sound work called History Haunts the Body, and it's been included in the Portrait Gallery in Scotland, which is just quite interesting. It's a sound work that's talking about the stories of women from Guyana who were in Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's letting these women's stories, or a kind of speculation of these women's stories, kind of enter the body of every listener. There's no image, there's details, and there's space for everybody to kind of hold on to those stories and picture themselves and picture their relatives and picture their friends and find a connection to these stories as they kind of hold them in their body when they're listening. That's also been made so that you can walk around, so you can literally walk with these stories whilst you're walking through the museum. And I think just kind of playing with those ways of, I guess, creating space to be responsive in a museum context feels really necessary, and also exciting, and like lots of possibilities for fun experimental ways of doing things.
Yeah, I find that most interesting, especially because as they're viewing these works of art, there's then almost an interjection of, well, these were being created. Here was I living in this space, and this is what I was going through. And I think, thinking about it in my mind's eye, that's a really, really powerful way of getting the people to view their space differently, getting them to view history differently as well. I can almost see that being taken outside of the museum on a type of a trail, where once you knew where in the city they lived, as you walk down that particular lane or that particular street, hearing their voices in a way echoing back to you, I think is extremely powerful. Especially because as a people, one of our greatest strengths lie in our narrative storytelling. Simply because we didn't. There's a point in time where we weren't taught how to write. So therefore, the oral tradition is the way in which we pass down our stories, in which we pass down our folklore, where we pass down our medicinal knowledge, and as such, using the voice as the art form to transcend what is happening to us in the body is extremely powerful. So I like that. Actually, I can see that working in different spaces. So yeah.
I've done that for my last two exhibitions, and I'm actually doing it with the new one that's coming up, Crafted Selves, where I had conversations with the artists. And because it's called Crafted Selves, the Unfinished Conversation, it's about having dual or multiple identities, but using craft to bring it out, because we are in Scotland. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was creating this exhibition, and this is where, again, I'm talking about co-creation, is having these conversations and thinking, you know, it's one thing for me as curator to stand and say dual identities equals this, this, and this. This is what I feel. And I said, I wanted instead the artists to have that moment to say what it meant to them, how it was affecting them, what they were doing. And so I've got two pieces of additional work, one which is nearly 3 hours long, which will go on a website, but then one which I cut down for the space within the exhibition. So as you're walking around the exhibition, you're actually hearing from these 13 artists saying what it means to them to have dual or multiple identities. And so within this narrative, we've brought in the voices of trans, gender, fluidity. You know, some people are very angry. Some people chose to tell stories about the racial bias. But what I found interesting and kind of, I guess, piggybacks onto what both of you guys are saying is, when I first listened to the full song bite, I kind of got very emotional because I could hear different emotions. But what struck me as very interesting was everybody figured out how to kind of find their joy. So we've got artists who, you know, were born in South Korea. We've got artists who were born in the Caribbean. We've got artists who were born in Africa, but they all live here in Scotland, and they all work in Scotland as artists. And for me, while the exhibition itself, the artworks are powerful, and this is why I always say I tend to curate people and their stories and not necessarily objects, it's because for me, what makes the exhibition is those stories, those narratives directly from the mouths of the artists. And I think that is so important. So I kind of agree with Ashanti when I feel like maybe museum curators have now kind of caught up to things where freelance curators or artists have been doing, because I've always used the element of narrative, because I always go back to, I learned about storytelling from my grandmother, and the things that were probably lost in terms of like food and culture, I retain because I learned those as I was learning to cook with her, you know, or make mauby, or, you know, fry some fish or whatever. And so I always kind of think there's this power in narrative storytelling. And so when I'm working with artists, when I'm working with collaborators, when I'm working with producers, I always kind of think about, okay, but what's the true story that I'm trying to tell here? It's not just about, you know, making this art piece, even though that's very important. It's really about who's the person behind the facade, I suppose, and how we then can tell that person's story without without really putting them in the limelight if they don't want to be. So, which leads me very nicely on. Now, we have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask this question and then I'm going to jump on. I guess for both of you again, who do you see as allies and how do you collaborate with them? How do you work and collaborate within the diaspora itself? And then how do you work and collaborate outside of the diaspora? And these are in your roles as artist, facilitator, curator, deputy director, archaeologist. How do you wear all those different hats and then bring them into space so that, again, you're working with multiple bodies and just creating something that's going to be so dynamic? I'm just here to ask the tough questions, people.
Yes, I was going to let Ashanti go and then I'll follow.
I was literally saying the exact same thing. I don't know. I've always kind of so I've always struggled a little bit with the word ally. Not for any reason. It just, I feel like there's so much tied up in it, and maybe even, I guess, collaborator feels like a better word for me. In Project X, the organization that I co-direct, which platforms and champions dance from the African and Caribbean diaspora. I know it's a little bit confusing because I'm a sculptor also working with dance, but I really come from the belief that all of these things are embodied and really tied up in each other, and music, dance, and sculpture is all interconnected. But when we're doing our work with Project X, we have this phrase that we use in relation to collaboration, and we talk about it as equitable exchange and conversation. We're co-piloting towards our shared destination. And I think when I'm thinking about collaborators, it's really that idea of like co-piloting and a shared destination. We're each doing our own thing, where we each have our specific skills and roles and ideas and stories that we're bringing it, but it's about a kind of shared, and our individual experiences, but it's about this kind of shared destination, this shared thing that we're moving towards. So when I think about the people I'd like to work with, people I'd like to collaborate, it's really like the people that have this shared goal of, I guess, empowering people, celebrating diversity and culture, celebrating art and creativity, finding ways for people to, I guess, like learn and engage through creativity. That's the kind of, I think, yeah, they're the kind of guiding things in relation to, finding people to collaborate with.
For me, for the museum, I'd say it's about patience and listening and learning. And for us, it's about collaboration and co-creation. The people that we are engaging with have an equal say in what we're doing. We're guided by their experience and sometimes their wants, and you kind of have to almost constantly manage that curatorial voice that says it must be done this way. No, it doesn't have to be done this way. Once you're willing to recognize that you're not in control, that you're there looking for a shared outcome based on a shared experience, it becomes a lot freer. It can also be a little bit discombobulating because you're taught as a curator to always have tight rein. You've got to move away from that. It's no longer a tight rein. It's about helping to co-facilitate and also to learn, because this community is coming with knowledge that you are clueless about, that you simply have to be open to. And I think that becomes really important. And the other important thing in there is respect. You've got to respect the knowledge, you've got to respect people's time, and you've got to respect the stories. And I think once you have them in line, and maybe respect is the first pillar, then all other things are possible. But it's the key thing: respect, patience, listening, and learning. And I think once you have those 4 pillars in place, then what you create will be not just important, but in some instances a little bit revolutionary as well, because you've never done it this way. And then the communities who turn up, who've always shied away from the museum, oh well, we didn't think it was the place for us, or we didn't think that our story would ever be there. You try to break down all of those barriers, and that's when you recognize that moving along the lines of co-curation becomes a lot more democratic. And that's where we need to be. We need to be a lot more democratic and allowing these multiple stories to be told. Yeah.
Well said. Well said, sir. I have some questions now from the audience that's listening. The first one is from Kadia. Hi, Kadia. She says, I'm familiar with Ashanti's work and Kat's work. I would like to know more if they've worked with archives of diaspora that are oral within their practice. Examples, stories, and conversations. One for Ashanti could talk about art practice in relation to ancestral knowledge.
Yeah, sure. I suppose, I mean, yes, I've done a lot of work with oral archives, or with people, actually, with people and sharing stories. But actually, I guess a way that I'd like to respond to this question is sharing kind of embodied archival, the embodied archive. One of the reasons I really love working with dance is because it's a gorgeous embodied archive. You can take photographs of it and you can video record it till the ends of time, but actually dance is a practice that's shared from person to person. It's taught from person to person. And when you are receiving a dance or being taught how to do a dance by someone else, you are embodying this person's relation, the person teaching it to you's relationship to that dance, and the person who taught them, and the person who taught them, to the beginning of time when the dance was created, and every little extra chapter of the story that's been added as it's been passed on to each person. So by sharing a dance that you know, or by learning a dance that somebody else knows, it's a way of sharing a little bit of that embodied archive that everybody carries in themselves. It's the same with sharing oral stories, the same with sharing songs, the sharing recipes. And actually, I really apply that to a lot of the sculptural practices that I work with. I like to work with traditional methods of making sculpture that embody long legacies from cultures, from people, from places, as a way to kind of directly engage with history through physically making something. I think thinking about all of these ways of engaging with things as engaging with an archive is really, really exciting, and could, I guess, really, it's where everybody's going with the future of archives. And I loved the projects that you're talking about, Kevin, where people were invited to respond to that gaze and almost like turn it on its head. It's like making these spaces about the people, because I guess history is about people. It is about the people, and it's about the people in the present who are taking the time to engage with that history and tell stories about that history. So if it's about people, then like it's in the body, like work with it in the body.
Thank you. So we've got another one from Catherine, and she says, hello to you three. It's a pleasure to hear about your experiences. I really related to Ashanti's activism, and I have a question about the political aspect that can derive from it. I myself am opening a women's only gallery in Paris, and I would like people to focus on the art and not on the political aspect of it. What were your experiences about it?
Yeah, a total mixture. And I think in my own experiences, so when me and my collaborators, Melly Brooms and Ria Lewis, set up Project X, we wanted to create an organization that was delivered by and for people of African and Caribbean heritage, in recognition that people of African and Caribbean heritage were not previously being represented, were not being cared for, were not being treated right. And we just, honestly, we just wanted to take it into our own hands. It was about creating a space that we could exist within and creating a space that the people around us could exist within. And within that, working to create a wider space that's more equitable and more holistic in terms of cultural representation in Scotland. And it's been a journey. We started working in 2016, and we've gone through I feel like we have a lot of what I guess define as successes or wins, where I feel like we have changed quite a lot of performance and dance organizations for the better. I feel like they have really listened and engaged, and everything, all of the pillars that you said, Kevin, there's been patience, there's been respect, and a lot of, I find that the sector is kind of engaging in a way that is really looking at what's being produced and allowing that to kind of shine without it necessarily being purely about kind of this is our equality and diversity action plan, and letting it actually be about what's happening and what's being produced. But then that also still happens, and that's just part of the constant fight of not just being kind of extracted and put into this category of an equality and diversity action plan, and there isn't respect, there isn't patience, there isn't care, there isn't any listening. And I think it's a hard one, and I wish it wasn't, but I think it's all part of the, I'm committed to the journey towards it being better because I have no choice. Like I'm committed because I have no choice. And I suppose I also appreciate it when people recognize that I'm committed, or like, because I have no choice, and find a way to give me choice as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Kevin, this one is for you. It's from Louis Marie. She says, museums must be connected with the community in order to know the feeling of the community, their problems, their difficulties. I assume that's difficulties, because museums have to give opportunity to community in order to be in touch with authorities. What tools has the museum has and can put to community? I can put community in touch with authorities, for example.
Thanks, Louis Marie. I think that the first tool has to be openness. Whether it's a formal call of the museum to say to the community, well, what do you want to see? And they've got to sometimes use non-traditional means. In the region, calling programs are very popular. It's a way in which the public communicates their anger and or pleasure at what's being done. And sometimes you need to go to those links. You do a calling program. You go into communities, find out who the community's leaders are, and find out what that community wants. But you've got to spend the time. You've got to invest the time to communicate and then listen. And then out of that, see what are some of the concrete things that you can do to affect change. So the museum is just not a passive recipient. That's gone. Especially if you're a museum in a developing country, you can't be passive. So for me, museums are political because every action is political. Your decision to acquire a particular object for whatever reason is a political act. And sometimes you need to be cognizant of what that political act is. And then when you do the engagement, acknowledge, well, that's what we're doing. But recognize that you're an agent of change. The idea that you are objective isn't true. You're not. You never were. It's a kind of a false trope that was created. So recognize that being a change agent is part of what museums do. And hopefully you're coming down on the side of inclusivity in that curatorial practice and being allowed to give voice to those difficult conversations in the community that you represent and is then representative of you. So I hope that kind of answer Louis Marie's question.
Thank you, guys. I have one last question, which is definitely for myself, and it's one that we'll be ending on. Which is, we all know that this work is now more important than ever, as certain parts of society seems to be rapidly going backwards, definitely in the wrong direction. But yet there's an overwhelming lack of support within the arts. So my question to you is, how are you actually getting anything done? Because I am spending all my time doing funding applications.
I think we all are. We exist in a sector, regardless of your geographical location, where funding is hard. People argue there are more important things than funding the museum and art. But you turn around and one of the fastest consumed items is in fact museums and art, in sometimes a direct or indirect way. The other important thing that museums and cultural practitioners have to almost build into what they're doing is, part of your job is you run the business. Part of your job is identifying those stakeholders for whom you can go to, who will fund the activities that you want to do. That is part of your job. The money will not appear. You have to go after it, but you have to deliberately and systematically recognize that part of your job is to do just that, and to court the different stakeholders, drop a list and decide, well, they like to only fund these things. Okay, well then I'm going to go into them for X, and I'm going to somebody else to Y, and say to them up front, well, I'm in the business of sharing stories and communicating, and this is how what I'm doing can help you. Recognize that as part of what we do as well.
Well said. Ashanti?
Yeah, to add on to that, I keep going back to the sort of 4 pillars that you talked about, Kevin. I think when you've taken the time to listen and build trust with a community, with respect, with patience, with all of these things, then the community helps you. Like they help you in so many different ways. I think if you really are working with them in these ways, then they fight for you when you don't get the funding. They come together, they support you, they find ways to get things done, they offer resources. Like, I think when you do co-curate and collaborate with communities in this way, that's how you get stuff done, because actually there's so much power in collectivity and there's so much power in community. And I think that is, I mean, I definitely know that that's the way that I do it, and I feel like that is going to be a huge part of fighting within these times of funding cuts and cost of living crisis and all of these things.
Thank you, guys. I want to say thank you to our audience for sticking with us and for asking questions, for being involved. Please reach out and get in contact with Ashanti and Kevin directly, get them involved.